In the Great Depression, Congress passed a law requiring the Federal Reserve to create something called the FOMC. That is the Federal Open Market Committee. The fact that it has that word open market in there means it must buy and sell something. So the primary purpose of this committee, or functional part of this committee, is to buy and sell stuff, and we'll talk about that in a second. The FOMC is the supposedly seven members of the Board of Governors, plus 5 of the district presidents. So the president of New York is always on there, and then 4 of the other presidents rotate around. So here in 2020, Mary Daly is a voting member of the FOMC. Last year she was a non-voting but get to sit at the table member. Next year she'll be you get to watch but not really play with everybody else. And the year after that she'll be sit at the table but not vote. And then the year after that she'll get to vote. Okay, so they rotate in and out of the FOMC, except for New York and the 7. And why would you have New York on the time? Well, if you want to buy or sell financial stuff, where do you do that? Oh yeah, you do that in New York. So the president of the New York Bank needs to be on this FOMC all the time because it's the New York Bank that's actually going to do the buying and selling, because the markets where you go buy and sell bonds and stuff is in New York. It's exciting. I know. So they function by buying and selling government bonds. That's why it's called an open market committee. They buy and sell. And nowadays they actually buy and sell stuff other than government bonds. We think of them as buying and selling government bonds. But in fact, now they do other stuff. And we'll get to that when we get there. But technically, buy and sell government bonds. And they're going to do this to control the money supply and set interest rates. All right. They do other things to set interest rates but the reason it's called the Federal Open Market Committee is they're playing around with the money supply. All right. How do we do this? Well, open market operations, buying and selling. Let's suppose that I'm the Fed and I want to put more money. I've got money sitting here, right? The Treasury prints money, but the Fed's job to put that money onto circulation. So I want to increase the money supply. I'm the Federal Reserve. There's not enough money out there. I need to put money out there. What am I going to do? I could rent a helicopter and just fly over America and throw it out the window, but that's probably not very effective, right? So here's what I do. There's people who own bonds, and those people are earning some interest from the Treasury, and they're waiting, and when their bond will mature, then they're going to go get their money back from the Treasury. So let's suppose that you paid, $9,900 for a Treasury bill that in a year you're going to trade in and get $10,000 off, right? A lot of Treasury securities, you don't get a separate interest check. You buy the bill for less, all right? You buy it for less than the face value, and then when it comes due, you get the face value. So you're going to buy a $10,000 bond. Maybe you pay $9,990 for that bond, and then a year from now you get $10,000. All right. So you're sitting there, you've got this bond, and you're expecting to get $10,000 from it, next month, and you're just waiting for it to come due. And there's a knock on your door, and it's Jay Powell, and he says, "Hi. I'll give you $10,050 for that bond right now, cash." Well, what are you going to do? Are you going to wait a month to get your $10,000, or are you going to take the $10,50 now? I think you're taking the $10,050 right now, right? Okay. What have I just done if I'm Jay Powell? Where'd I get the $10,050 to buy that bond? The Treasury printed it for me, or I just went into a computer, right, and created bits and bytes. But either way, I've just increased the money supply by $10,050. Every time the Fed buys a bond, it's taking new money that's not in circulation, and it's giving it to somebody who can now go out and spend it. So the Fed can increase the money supply by buying bonds. And again, it used to just buy government bonds, now it buys other kinds of bonds. We'll talk about that in another chapter. Okay? But that's how we increase the money supply. Well, we do the opposite to decrease the money supply. So it turns out the Fed actually owns trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of U.S. government bonds. It owns all these bonds that it bought from people. How do I decrease the money supply? Well, I find somebody who wants to buy a bond. So they're out there, people are out there now, and they're going to go to the Treasury. They've got cash. So I have, $9,990, and I'm going to go buy a $10,000 bond from the Treasury. Before I get there, Jay Powell goes, stop. Right? Listen up. I will sell you that $10,000 bond. Right? You were going to pay $9,990 for it. I'll sell it to you for $9,980. Well, you're like, that's a deal. Am I going to get in trouble? No, I'm the Fed. So instead of paying your $9,090 to the Treasury, who's just going to give it to the government to spend, you pay your $9,980 to the Fed, and they just go shred it. Now we've lowered the money supply by $9,980. So we increase the money by buying bonds, and the Fed decreases the money supply by selling bonds. Hopefully that just made sense. Okay, so the Fed has other tools, and we'll talk about these really quick now and then more over the next couple chapters. But banks, we already talked about the fact banks can go borrow from the Fed, right? A bank can get a loan from the Fed. Well, the interest rate that the Fed charges is called the discount rate. So if you go to the window and you get the discount rate is, except during really serious financial crises, the discount rate is what they say symbolic. People don't actually go to the Fed and borrow money. It's like going to your mom. You don't go to your mom and borrow money if you can avoid it because your mom, right? She'll make you feel bad about it for a long time even after you paid it back. So people don't generally go to the Fed to borrow money. They do that only during really, really bad financial times. So 2007, 2008, 2009, there were banks that were going and borrowing from the Fed, but normally, zero. Okay? Banks borrow from each other, and for very short term, like overnight. And the Federal Reserve controls that interest rate. It's called the federal funds rate. They don't control it directly. They manipulate things to keep it in a range. They say, we're going to keep it in this range, and then they do things to keep it in that range. They play in the market. But the Fed funds rate, the federal funds rate, that's the rate that banks charge each other for really quick loans, right? So you have just a split, an emergency. In the old days, you had to have you had to keep your 10%, right? That was the old system, the old school system. You had to have 10%. Well, what happens if the Fed is coming to check and see if you have your 10%? You don't have your 10%. Well, you call up some other bank and you borrow some money for them just long enough for the auditor to come in, and then you give it back. Okay, that's what the federal funds system originally is, and now it's basically the same thing, but not for exactly the same reason. The most important thing the Fed does right now is pays interest on reserves. So if the Fed and right now in May of 2020, the Fed is paying 0.1%. They're not paying very much on reserves. Okay? If the Fed wants banks to slow down and not make loans to other people and just hold on to their money, all they've got to do is raise the interest rate on reserves. And the higher they raise the interest rate on reserves, the less lending banks will do. They just put the money with the Fed, it's all safe, and they'll just sit there and earn their interest. Okay? When the Fed lowers it like it is now and lowers that interest rate on reserves, then that encourages banks to go out and try to find other places to use their money. Okay? So by changing the interest rate on reserves, the Fed's changing how banks function. It's exciting. Okay. We need to talk quickly about the crisis of 2007 through 2009. So that guy on the right was the chairman of the Federal Reserve back then. His name is Ben Bernanke. And he tells this story, and I'm just going to really quickly summarize it here. Then in the years leading up to the crunch, the financial crisis, $900 billion a year of savings from other countries was flowing into the United States. Savings primarily from China and from the Middle East, but from all over the world. And you were getting up to $900 billion a year of foreign savings flowing into the United States. Where is it? Where should it go? And the answer was there aren't good investments to put it in. And there are theories about how this happens and why this happens, but not our point yet. We'll get to those eventually. So, Wall Street, the folks on Wall Street are very creative. If people walk into their offices and say, hey, I have a $1 billion I want to invest, they're going to find you some decent way to invest it. Okay? One of the things that we get lots and lots of in the 2000s, they've existed for a long time, but there was an explosion of them after the financial reform that happened in 1999. A derivative is a financial instrument that's backed by another financial instrument. So if I buy my house, right? When I bought my house, I signed a piece of paper. That mortgage is a financial instrument. It's a what's called commercial paper. It's sellable. The bank can sell my mortgage to somebody else and get money back from it. Okay? But that piece of paper that I signed, my mortgage, even though, Bank of America could sell it to Wells Fargo, who could sell it to Citibank, who could sell, you with me? That piece of paper is tied to my house. So there's a physical asset out here, my house, that is the basis for that piece of paper having value. And when one bank sells it to another bank, the new bank still has an attachment to my house, and that makes them feel fairly secure about that piece of paper. Okay? Now, a derivative is a piece of paper that's built on another piece of paper, which may or may not be secure as having a physical asset out there. Beyond that, the financial reform that happened in 1999 took all regulation off. So the Securities Exchange Commission, the people who would normally regulate these kinds of things, couldn't regulate those derivatives. And banks are highly creative. So again, the Bernanke story is you have two things happening at the same time. You have all of this cash flowing in from outside the United States, and you have these unregulated banks, and Bernanke says the banks didn't really understand the riskiness of what they were doing. Other people think the banks completely understood the riskiness of what they were doing and overestimated what could happen, or they didn't care and they just took the money or whatever. There's all kinds of different stories, but the Bernanke story is money comes in from outside the United States, banks get creative in an unregulated, uncontrolled way with what to do about it, and they didn't really understand what they were doing. Okay. We have these banks creating something called collateralized debt obligations. It's when we use an IOU to create another IOU. So my mortgage is a debt obligation. I owe money to whoever owns that piece of paper. That piece of paper says, I will pay you this amount of money every month until such and such a date. Okay? Right. Now, I can create another piece of paper. So if I'm a bank and you owe me $1,000 a month on your mortgage, I can go borrow maybe $100,000 from somebody else, and you say to them, look, if I don't pay you, you get this $1,000 a month stream. So the homeowner's paying $1,000 to the bank borrows $100,000 from somebody else. The person who's loaning the bank the money, if the bank doesn't pay them, they get the $1,000 a month in the mortgage payment. Okay? That's a collateralized debt obligation. I'm using the mortgage payment as collateral against this other loan. All right? We're going to use the term bond in all this, James Bond. A bond is just a loan that happens without a bank. So UNLV sold bonds. We issued bonds. When we increased the size of the Thomas & Mack and remodeled the Thomas & Mack, investors bought those bonds directly from the university through our bond seller. So there's a link. The university is paying these bondholders. Every month, these bondholders get money from the university until the bonds are paid off. Okay? It's just a loan, But instead of UNLV going to the bank and then the bank going to people to get money to loan to UNLV, there's just no bank in the middle. It's essentially a direct loan between investors and whoever issued the bond, UNLV in that case.